So hi, good morning everyone. My name is Haley Tompkins. I'm the branch manager at the Crozet Library, and we're here today to talk about creativity in the second session of Parenting with Neuroscience by Dr. Erin Clabough. Dr. Clabough is a neuroscientist. She's a professor and an author of Second Nature, How Parents Can Use Neuroscience to Help Kids Develop Empathy, Creativity, and Self-Control. We have that at the library, and we also have an ebook copy available to download as well. We'll continue this series with two follow-up sessions. The next one is going to be Friday, June 26th at 10 a.m. We're going to be focusing on empathy at that session. And then Friday, July 10th at 10 a.m. we'll focus on self-control. This will be recorded and available on the JMRL YouTube channel after this. And I'll email the link out to everyone that's attending as well. And if you have any questions, you can type below and in the Q&A, and Dr. Clabough will answer them at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Clabough, because I know we're all excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Haley.
Yeah.
So I've tried to incorporate any questions that I got into the presentation itself. So I'm also happy to kind of monitor and see if there are hands, but it might make sense to just do a Q&A session at the end, like Haley said. So I'm really, really excited to be here with you guys today. As I was kind of thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, I got really excited because I feel like creativity is such a fun thing to talk about and to do, and we don't really do enough of it. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about a lot today is why we don't do more of it. Because most people, when they have a little break and they get a creative burst, or they have some downtime and they get to be creative, it feels really good. And so why is this kind of disconnect between what we know is important, think is important, and then what we actually do in our day-to-day life? So I want to share my screen for a PowerPoint. Can you enable host screen sharing?
Did it not do that already?
No. Oh, I'm sorry. You have to make it attendee screen sharing for me to be able to do it.
I made you a co-host, that should do it.
Perfect. Okay, so this is kind of all stemming from a book that I have called Second Nature, which basically has tools for parents to cultivate creativity, empathy, and self-control, which is what these parenting sessions are about. So we're going to do creativity first, which is the topic today. And these skills are the ones that I, through lots of reading and parenting for kids and being a neuroscientist, really discovered that are the most important to our success for our kids, including happiness and the idea of what success means. And this kind of happened through my own parenting journey, looking at my kids and looking at what I did in the lab and kind of trying to figure out how those two things come together. So empathy, self-control, and creativity kind of are all interconnected. But what I realized when I was doing research on all of these is that they're interconnected in a way that actually taps into so many other things that we think about. So a lot of the times we're using different words, but still talking about these same things that are subcomponents or elements of these big things: empathy, creativity, and self-control. And so I think if you just kind of look at this, every parent wants their kids to be able to have all these kind of traits or skill sets that are up there. And so what I realized from my own research is that when we're trying to teach kids how to have all these qualities that we want them to have, that neuroscience actually tells us an awful lot about how to get there. And there literally is a roadmap for how to cultivate these pathways in ways that are lasting in our kids and in ourselves. But a lot of times the research doesn't get disseminated in a way that is helpful to parents. Sometimes it's too complex, or it's too kind of like one little nugget that doesn't connect back to other fields, because neuroscientists are really good at one tiny little piece of one cascade or one molecule or one part of a neuron in one part of the brain. And it's hard to take that big knowledge about a little space and connect it in a way that makes sense for people to use in day-to-day life. So this book is me kind of trying to do that for us. So it's the book that I kind of was trying to read as a parent and couldn't find out there. So when we're talking specifically about creativity, what I realize is about doing this research is that creativity is important in a lot of ways that I didn't realize that it was beforehand. And it's important as an underlying skill for empathy and for self-control, two of these other things that are shown to be important for kid success and kid happiness by the time they reach adulthood. So I also would say that a lot of adults say that creativity is important. There was a study that was done by Time a couple years ago where 62% of people said that they actually feel like they didn't get as much creativity training or learning about creativity in terms of that it was more important to their job than they thought that it would actually be. And so this is a disconnect too in how we are educating our kids. We're not educating creativity into our kids. And I think a lot of parents that I've talked to say the opposite. So we actually feel like as a society, we are creatively like educating the creativity out of our kids. And so this disconnect again is important to be aware of and to address and to try to figure out why this is. These three skills are hard to teach, even though they're so important. And one thing that's kind of uniting about all of them is that these are things that computers can't do. These are really biological qualities that have a lot of things in common. And they all come together through this really big skill. It's like the most of what it means to be human, which is self-regulation. How do I, the human, regulate myself? So am I in control of myself? Can I make good choices? Can I choose between options that's more than just one? Can I figure out how what I choose is going to affect other people? Can I stop myself if I'm going in the wrong direction? Can I pivot? So this idea of self-regulation is really important. But importantly too, none of these can be forced. So empathy, creativity, and self-control are never anything that you can top down approach this. You have to be able to cultivate this in an individual. And there are ways that we can do this. So one of the things that I realized as I was looking into the literature on creativity and talking to parents about creativity is that people define creativity differently. And in terms of its importance to our parenting and to our kids' well-being, it depends on how we define it. So there's kind of two camps for the definitions for creativity. The first one is this definition of more of like an Eastern tradition, where it's an awareness of the truth about either yourself or an object sometimes, or an event. So we can think of this more as like self-actualization, finding a new point of view or perspective, typically from within yourself. And this is more important maybe than breaking with the traditional way that things have always been done. It's more just about being still with yourself and finding truth. So that's kind of one way that parents define creativity. The other way to define it is this Western tradition of creativity, which is innovation. And it's the act of actually taking the things that you realize and putting them towards a specific purpose. So this definition of creativity is always defined by the presence of two things. One, it's an originality of an idea. And then two, it's effectiveness. So can you come up with a new idea to solve a problem or to make things better or to be more effective than whatever was there before? And this is typically how Americans think about creativity, as utility. So invention with utility. If you think about creativity as more of the Western tradition, American parents are more likely to cultivate that in our kids. If you think about it in terms of the more Eastern traditions, this is something that sometimes we kind of squeeze out when we're like going through a busy day and we don't really allow the time or the space or the autonomy for people to find their own truth. Both of these things are kind of two halves of the same whole, meaning that they're both the truth. So how you find your own truth and then how you apply it to your life or to what's around you is truly a more holistic way to approach the idea of creativity. So what was so cool about what I found in my research is that creativity is teachable, which I did not know going into this this research. I think I thought of it more like a trait or a characteristic of a person or a personality kind of trait. where you either kind of are really creative or you are not. But there's a lot about creativity that is something that we can cultivate, just like we do with piano or soccer or any other skill set that we are trying to get our kids to learn, or that we're trying to kind of work on in ourselves. One thing that was also very interesting to me is that when you look at people who are trying to teach other people about learning or about anything, about creative processing and things like that, what's interesting is that the creative training programs are more effective if they include a little bit about neuroscience in them. So if you actually teach in a graduate level class, when you're trying to train creativity in adults, if you teach them about neuroscience, it makes them more creative because they understand the process and this kind of insight into the process, that some things take a long time, how neurons connect together. These things actually make it so that we become more creative because we understand it better. And so as parents, if we understand more about the creative process, we too can teach it better, and we will also get better at being creative ourselves. So with that in mind, I'm going to have a couple slides to teach you kind of basics about some neurons and how they connect together. So the neuron here is on the right. This neuron to me looks a lot like a tree, which is on the left. And so I've kind of put them side by side so you can see how similar they really are. They both have kind of the top with branches on it. If you're a tree, it's the same thing as the cell body in the neuron, which has a lot of little dendrites that stick up off it. And this is where the information comes in. We're receiving information up on the top. The trunk of the tree is similar to the axon in the neuron, which is a projection that goes out with the specific purpose of communicating. So it's sending information from that cell body to a different part of the brain. So the trunk then goes down under the ground. You don't see them, but the roots are there and they're pretty extensive. This is similar to the terminal branches, or where that neuron connects to the next neuron. So somehow at the end of that axon, it has to disseminate that information to another neuron. And that happens down there at the terminal branches. And when information comes in, it always comes in the top and down the bottom. Okay, so it's similar to the way that lightning would strike a tree. It always strikes the branches and then comes down the trunk and out through the roots. It can never go back up like towards the sky. So it's the same thing with the neuron all the way. It's a one-way highway. All neurons just kind of go in that one direction. And this is how we have these pathways that we end up having when neurons connect together. So you end up having input coming in over here on the left, and it goes to the second neuron. And the second neuron goes in just one direction to the third, and the third goes on. And this could happen in a circuit of 1 or 2 neurons, or it could happen for many, many neurons with this relay system of information. So I want to take a second now that we've talked about what a neuron looks like and how it kind of works, and talk about this idea with creativity. There's a pervasive idea in our culture that the right brain is creative and the left brain is logical, or this idea that you can be left-brained or right-brained kind of as a person in the way that you approach life. Both of these are completely wrong, okay? So I want to really make sure that we, instead of thinking about these things as left brain or right brain, or that creativity is housed over in the right brain, please understand that the truth is that in creative thought, the more creative that you are, it's actually the amount of interconnectivity that you have between both sides of your brain and between the spaces in your brain on the same side. And this happens on the right side as well as it does on the left side. So there's a lot of studies that have shown that, this isn't the case. And I'm not exactly sure how this got out there. It's probably because there was some human imaging studies that were done where they show activation on one side more than the other side. But typically these studies are really, they use only right-handed participants, and there are some lateralization that happens when you have right-handed versus left-handed. But I think it's important for us to understand that instead of just trying to cultivate one half of the brain versus the other half of the brain, the interconnectivity is really the important thing here. So I want to tell you guys about 3 things that happen when a brain is developing. So from the time when you have just, 2 cells to the time that you are an adult, you go through 3 stages. Some of these stages really parents don't have any control over or any say in what happens during them. So in neuronal birth and migration, really, we don't have a lot of wiggle room with what happens. We just need to kind of get proper nutrition and make sure that we don't have any toxins on board during pregnancy. For the second one, this is synaptogenesis. The synapses are the connection points between two neurons. And genesis means they're being born, right? So we've got synaptogenesis, or the creation of all these connection points between the neurons that have been born and gone to their final brain destinations and other neurons. So the synaptogenesis is really important for the forming of memories and the pathways and just functionality in our brain. And it starts about halfway through pregnancy, and it goes throughout, you know, right before adolescence is when this giant period really stops. However, synaptogenesis never stops. So brain development here never really ceases. In fact, you right now are making connections, making new synapses form, or strengthening synapses that you have, or weakening ones that you don't use, just by listening to me talk about creativity. So this is a really powerful way that we can actually help the creative process along by thinking about the synapses that are connecting together and what kind of experiences we want our kids to have in order to strengthen the ones that we want to see remain. Myelination is the third one. Myelination is this event that happens where neurons' axons get wrapped with this white tissue, which is another cell type actually, but it's called myelin. Myelin makes signals go faster down the axon. And myelination is something that is a normal process, and it happens right before birth, kind of in the third trimester, and it goes all the way up until, you know, your 30s. So when this happens, you are actively using these neuronal pathways, and the ones that are used are more likely to become myelinated. When they're myelinated, you're making them faster. So the brain is all about trying to make us more efficient. And we do this by strengthening or supporting or giving resources towards the things that we use, and by not giving those resources and weakening the ones that we don't use. So this idea about myelin, this is kind of what myelin looks like. It's wrapping, a coating, it's insulation that allows the electricity that goes down this neuron to actually go faster. And in active brain circuits, myelin gets more, it's increased, the thickness gets greater. All right, so this then translates to these brain pathways. So you can have input coming into one neuron. That neuron doesn't just talk to one other neuron, it talks to many other neurons. It can have a lot of synapses, a lot of connection points. And so you have lots of pathways, some of which are being excited and some of which are being inhibited. And this is a slide over on the right. This is actually a picture of a brain section through a microscope that's been stained for myelin. So the myelin shows up as a pink or red here. And this is actually a mouse brain, but it's pretty much the exact same as the way that our brain looks in terms of the connection between hemispheres. This, what you're seeing here, the red, is the corpus callosum, which is the main pathway that connects the left and the right hemispheres to share information between both sides of our brains. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that these interconnections, so things like the corpus callosum, are increased or bigger in people who are more creative. So this is one place where the creativity is, so it's in the connections everywhere between our parts of the brain. But it's also really interestingly in the connections between the limbic system, which is kind of what we would call like the lower down or the old brains. People might call it the lizard brain. So these are like where our gut impulses spring up, our fight or flight, our emotional content, specifically to do with fear or things that just kind of spring up organically for us. And then you have other places in the cortex, which is higher up. So the temporal lobes here and the prefrontal lobes, their association cortexes there, cortices there, that actually temper the information coming up from the limbic system, which is lower down right in the middle, like further underneath. And what happens is ideas spring up, things spring up, emotions spring up, thoughts spring up, and the prefrontal and temporal association cortex, they come in and they temper them. So they say, well, actually relate that back to what you know about how you should be acting on the playground and don't hit that other kid. Or they might say, hey, I know that you think that that would be a great idea to flip the trampoline upside down and to use it as a mock car and pretend like you're an airline pilot. But last time that happened, there was a hole in it and you got in trouble. So maybe it's not such a good idea. So this whole rational thought process that we think of as being like a mature individual, this is happening when you tamp down those things coming up from the limbic system. And it's interesting because this is where it's thought that creativity actually really has a home, because all these interconnections between all these places and the interplay between them, information coming up, that's like a go, and then this information tamp down that's coming, no, actually that's not a go. Remember how we are as humans. This is important because there's actually people that have a slight frontal lobe dysfunction where they're not able to tamp down things coming up from their limbic system, and they're more creative. So it's actually, creativity has become what we think of as like a slight dysfunction or an abnormality, because we're so good at as parents and as teachers and as a society at tamping down those things that are going to seem stupid, or they're going to fail, or that just kind of are embarrassing to think about. These things we need to, as a society, as a culture, as in our homes, we need to allow these thoughts from the limbic system to come up in a way where, yeah, if they're going to hurt other people, we want to tamp them down. But we shouldn't not be verbalizing these things and exploring these things just because we think that we're going to look stupid or that we're going to fail. So that's kind of where these things are in the brain. So if we know we can teach creativity, and we know where it is in the brain, and we kind of have defined it, as parents, we can kind of see what it is, then why don't we teach it more? And these are the things that I've come up with as to why it's hard to teach. So it's really hard to teach creativity because the rules aren't firm. Everybody kind of does it differently. And this is one of these hallmarks of why computers can't do creativity, is because they follow rules. They can apply rules. They're not flexible. They can't kind of disregard the rules, because a lot of times they don't know why the rules were made. So it's really important that we understand that if we want to teach creativity, we have to talk about this with ourselves and with our kids. Why are the rules there? And when is it okay to bend the rules? And actually have practice bending the rules. And even better than that, try to teach your kids to be the ones that come up with the rules, especially if the rules aren't working. And this can happen in a discipline situation, in a home situation. These ideas of, parent top down, these are the rules, we're going to follow them, doesn't allow for our kids to be able to explore their own creative process in a way that is applicable to their own lives. And therefore, then they can't take it and apply it to social situations that don't have to do with a parent. So when there can be kid input on things like rules, that's really important to do. And you can start small and get bigger. All right, second, so it requires a lot of personal space and freedom to allow people to explore their creativity. And you know what, that's hard to do. It's really hard to let go as parents. And it's even harder for us to do it as teachers, especially when the next one here, so control has to be relinquished. You have to have that space, and then it can be really counteractive to getting things done. We want to be productive. We want to kind of assess that we're doing well as teachers. We want to get to the doctor's appointment on time if we're like a parent. So it's really hard sometimes to make the space to do it. And then the last thing is it's hard to assess. So you don't know if you're doing a good job. You don't know if they're being more creative or if you're culturing it or cultivating it, because there aren't really a lot of great tests for creativity. We don't know when we're being successful at creativity. It involves failure a lot of the time. But creativity is a mindset. And what we're trying to do as parents is we're trying to put these creative experiences in our kids' lives in a way that it becomes how they approach the world. So it doesn't become like a pass or a fail. It becomes a tool in the way that they can interact with what's around them. Okay, so creativity then, we're going to focus on this. And the other thing that's really important, especially for teachers to understand, and for us as parents when we're trying to get our kids to kind of understand different concepts, is that creativity, when we do it, it's rewarding and it activates dopamine pathways. Dopamine is one of the excitatory neurotransmitters in our brains, and it is responsible for reward and for kind of motivation and for feeling good. So if you have, there's a lot of drugs of abuse actually that tap into dopamine release because it does feel so good. It can be addictive. So when you tap into the dopamine pathways, what's really cool about it is it also enhances learning. So the pathways that we have that are involved in synaptic plasticity, so the ability of the synapses to be modulated and the learning that happens when that modulation happens, dopamine underlies those synapses. And so if you teach something in a way that is creative, you're more likely to have that person retain the information that you were teaching to begin with. And it's really rewarding. So this creative experience, when we get to have it, and the more we do it, we'll end up releasing dopamine. And there have been studies that show that when we have, when we put ourselves in situations where dopamine is coming from a source other than a drug, like monkeys will choose to not do the drug as much because they're already getting their dopamine needs met. So this was shown in monkeys where there was a social construct where the dominant monkeys, they kind of were already being socially rewarded. And the dopamine was being released because they were the top monkeys. So they would not use cocaine as much when given a choice compared to the ones who were the underdogs. So they didn't feel good and they weren't having rewarding things happening in their lives because they were getting beat up by this top monkey. So they ended up going and using cocaine more. This is a really powerful thing for us to think about, that our kids need a certain base level of dopamine. We need to feel good. And that really creativity is one of the best ways to give our kids a dopamine burst that is so healthy for them, knowing that if they're not going to get that burst from the creative process or for other things within their own lives that give them this dopamine burst, that they may find it elsewhere. I think that's an important concept. So I have 3 kind of points for what we can do as a society, a culture, parents, teachers, to be able to culture creativity in our kids. And all of these work towards the ownership of actions and of choices and of self. And so creativity is a really important tool for kids to have in order to meet life expectations. So people who are more creative, they can be more empathetic and they can have more self-control because they have more tools at their disposal. Okay, so one of the first things that we need to do here is shift the power balance. So creative thought and teaching about creativity cannot come top down, right? We said we can't force this. So we have to give the kids the tools to be able to do it. This requires us teaching them about how the creative process works. It requires us teaching them about how neurons work, how synaptic plasticity works, how you can strengthen some synapses. And it requires us to really put the kid in the power position where they have as much choice as possible and we release control as much as possible so that they can do their own exploration of what works and what doesn't work, and so that they can take those first steps themselves. When you top down kind of put somebody in a corner with some Legos and say, create something, they're just going to sit there, or they'll probably bother their brother, or they'll come and find you in 2 minutes when you're on your Zoom call for work. It doesn't really work because it takes a lot of space. It takes a lot of practice. That's going to happen the first couple times we set somebody up in a creative space. But there are other ways we can get them involved to begin with. It's kind of like walking. The first couple times you're going to fall flat on your face, or you're going to crawl first, right? Nobody just starts running. So this idea of power and how we can give power to children in order so that they can really feel like they have some choices, because why would they generate more choices in their life if they're not even being able to if they're not even being allowed to choose from small choices that they already have? So this is a really important concept. This idea about being able to choose just for self, it leaks into everything in our life. So we learn more, we make the decisions ourselves. We also learn more when we are allowed to tap into the creative process. So be able to choose our own choices. When we make these decisions, then we're more likely to do the right thing because we'll own that, right? So when you get into the creative process and you have chosen those things for yourself, then you're more likely to own what you created. whether it's a beautiful work of art, whether it's an awful work of art, or whether it's a life choice to deal drugs on the side of the road. So we get better at making these decisions when we practice making the decisions. And when we make the decisions that are intentional, we are going to change our own lives. And then we are going to lead purposeful lives. So these little kernels and these nuggets that start with what seems like a Lego set or a creative choice as to, do you want to wear this outfit or make your own outfit today? It actually has a trickle up effect in the entire rest of their lives in terms of what they feel like is available to them. All right, so parents, what can we do? So the first thing that we can do in order to change this power dynamic and give the power back to the kids is we want to share knowledge. So teaching your kids about creativity, about how neurons work, about this creative process where you have like an incubation period where you're thinking about an idea and then you have to kind of ruminate on it, and then you have this aha moment, and that might take a while and take space, and then you actually end up being able to carry your idea out or to fruition. Like these stepwise processes are important to talk to kids about, that creativity takes space and it takes time and it takes like idea generation, that your first idea is not going to be your best idea. Or it might be, but you'll never know if it was if you only came up with one idea. So this other idea of allowing your child to be an expert in something is really important. This picture of a girl teaching, it was so hard for me to find a picture on the internet of a child teaching other children, or I could not even find a good picture of a child teaching an adult. And if we want to have our kids be able to have creative thought, there's been a lot of studies that show that the more competent you are in something, the more likely you are to be able to be creative with it. So have you ever come up to something and you didn't even know where to start because you have no tools, you don't know how it works? When you understand how something works, then you're able to use it in more creative ways. You have to understand the purpose for something first before you can change the future purpose of it. If you don't understand the rules of a situation, it's really hard to change them so that the rules better fit your wants and desires. So this idea of, if your child wants to know everything there is to know about dinosaurs, do everything you can to foster that so that they become an expert, and then ask them to teach you back or to teach someone else. All right, and encouraging your kids to read is a really good way to share knowledge as well. So Vyetsky said that, he was a Russian psychologist. He was the one that really said that if you want to give your kids this open landscape, you have to give them tools to be able to do it. And when they're little, they may not be able to experience all these different cultures or all these different perspectives. But when you read, it's a really easy way to get into someone else's head, to see how other people do it, and then use those tools to modify your own life approach. Another thing that we can do in order to give the power back is to be really open. So we want to foster openness in our kids. We want to foster openness in ourselves. We want to show them different cultures. There's been studies that show that kids who have other cultures either exposed to them more, or they live in another country for a while as an expatriate, or they are bilingual. All these things increase creativity because they're being taught that two different ways of coming to the same solution, two different ways of saying a word that means dog, are both appropriate and they're both right. And that's important. And along those lines, give experiences so that children can have these experiences that shape their way of approaching the world instead of toys. Withhold judgment. So this picture is one that I had put in the book when my 5-year-old daughter, we had just caught all these crabs and we cooked them because we were going to pick the crabs and eat them. And she sees this red crab shell and we pop it off and it's like upside down as we're picking the crabs, and she thought it was beautiful. And she said, I really want to keep it and turn it into a jewelry box and keep my treasures in it. And, of course, my first impulse, right, coming up limbic system is, that's a dead carcass of an animal and we're not going to use it to put our tiny jewels in. But, that's kind of amazing that she saw that and I didn't see it. And it was the very kernels of this idea of like this creative thought in a Western complex, right? So this is this Western idea of utility. So she saw something here that she could use in a different way that was useful to her. And it's really important that as a parent, I don't make any commentary at all that's negative. So, of course you can do that. Like, let me help you clean it. So this whole idea too about accept failures as part of a process, our kids are so scared to fail. And when you're scared to fail, you will never be creative. You will do things the one way that you think is the best way to success, and you will do it the way you've been taught. It's really important to embrace failure. And this can be as simple as, you know what, this isn't going to be a great long-term jewelry box at all, right? It's going to stink. It's going to be like fragile. It's going to have anyway, that doesn't matter that I think that. She gets to have the little jewelry box, and when she's done with it, she'll discard it and she'll come to her own conclusions about what made it a good jewelry box or a bad jewelry box. And I don't think that it'll last that long either. So this idea of accepting failures is important, and we need to pay attention to that as parents. When you say, oh, that won't work, or ew, that's gross, or just these first things that come to your mind, wait, think them, count to 3, and then say, you know what, is this going to help them? And if the answer is no, if it's not going to help them expand themselves, if it's not going to embrace their first idea as a good one and let's keep going, what else could you use it for? That's so cool, a jewelry box. I was thinking I could use it for a little boat for my pet mouse. Go with it. Try to get them to identify more ideas. All right, the second point on the 3 is this idea of scaffolding experience. So what I just gave you was an example of how you can verbally scaffold experience. So you have an idea and you're going to run with it. They had an idea and you try to teach them what other things they could do with it. It's really just talking through creative ideas there. One thing that I've realized is that as parents, we don't notice things sometimes that our kids do. And this might be our own kind of creativity getting drowned out by the lack of space in our life to do anything other than parent in the trenches. But these are some things, that I just kind of went back through my photos and looked at some things these are things that not everybody notices maybe. So I walk on the beach and I see this little root washed up on the beach, and it looks exactly like a little baby man doll to me. And this middle one this is a Drosophila brain, so a fruit fly brain that I had stained in the lab for 2 things, 2 different kinds of receptors in these neurons. I thought it looked exactly like a dragon. I was struck during confocal microscopy. I looked up and I was like, that's crazy, right? Last one. I am in my stock room in the department that I work in, and I see some tape. Someone has labeled it magic, and maybe it was magic tape, but that's amazing to me that I want to use that tape right now. There's so many things I want to put that tape on. So this idea of just stopping and being aware and staying open to these kinds of things, because it matters to our kids what we can engage with them in terms of this scaffolding. So verbal scaffolding is important. So talking through when somebody has an idea, what other things, kind of ask for more. This can happen when we say, what do you want to be when you grow up? They might say, I want to be a pediatrician. You can say, that's awesome. What else? You can be more than one thing. You can be a poet, paleontologist, triathlon, painter. That's fine. So keep going with that. This verbal scaffolding is important. This also is important for things like, oh, how could we have done that differently? So if you're in a situation where it's a conflict situation and somebody hits somebody else, you could sit down with your kid and say, let's be creative about all the other things you could have done in that situation. And that's important too. Okay, so this model creativity, it's not just what you notice, but try to kind of be creative in what you're doing. So here's an example of, I couldn't find the cat dish. I was at the beach, and so he ate out of one of these sand toys for a while, and my kids are like, what are you doing? But you know what, it works, and it's kind of cute for a second, and it only happened for a couple days until I found the bowl. But these kinds of things are okay to do. This is not a failure, this is a win, right? The cat thought it was a win. So this idea of life scaffolding is really important here. So showing them, you know what, I don't have a bowl. What should I do? And this works. The idea of modeling creativity is really important too, for things like idea generation or getting started on projects. So there's definitely been studies that have shown that if children are given examples of kind of ways to draw a tower or create an alien universe, that when they see other people doing it, they actually get better at their own things. But it's interesting because there's this kind of grace period where you can start them by showing them how you're going to do it. But if you take them all the way through the end of the process, still using yourself as a model, then their creativity gets worse. So you want to kind of start them, but then allow them to spin off on their own way without constantly checking back at what you're doing, because you don't want them to model what they're doing on what you're doing. You don't want them to have a complete carbon copy of your creativity. You want to start them, say, I'm going to do it this way. What are you going to do it? And then hopefully with that, you'll have these kind of different but parallel paths to the creative process. And the easiest way to do something like this is to, build a toothpick tower with peas and see what they can come up with, or show them examples of what experts have done and what is possible. So if you're doing Legos, go online and you can see this 10-piece Lego challenge, all the different things that people can build from the same 10 Legos, or all the different ways you can build a duck from the Legos that came in a little Lego kit with no instructions. So this is kind of these ideas about modeling, but also scaffolding these experiences for them. So the idea of practicing every day is important. So when we're practicing, we are doing these practicing through physical things that we're setting up for our kids to do, or we can do them through just talking through life events and idea generation. So experiential learning is the best way to model this kind of creativity and put these creative experiences in our kids' path. So we think of creativity as just like painting and drawing and art and music sometimes, but really creative processes can happen in anything where you're allowed to drive what happens yourself. And this is it, so anything in life. So I want to talk about how scientists define creativity, because I think it's important for parents to understand what the creative tests are when we're looking to see if someone's creative or not. And this is a situation when I would absolutely teach to the test. So convergent thinking is the idea that these ideas come together and there's one right solution. So you want to try to figure everything out to figure out how you can get the fox and the goose across the lake in the rowboat without the fox eating the goose one at a time. So this old riddle. So there is one way to do it, and you're trying to come up with the right idea of how to get there. This is an example of a remote associations task. And this one gives you 3 words, and you're supposed to come up with the one correct answer that links all 3 of the words together. So if you have square, cardboard, and open, you might think, what would that be? Maybe you'd think of box. Maybe you'd think of something else. So all these ones have one correct solution. And this test, when scientists give this test as a measure of convergent thinking, there is one right or wrong answer. And this is the way we teach our kids in school. This is one multiple choice right answer on a test. Okay. So if you look here are the answers so that they don't drive you crazy. So it was box for the first one. I got lucky on that. So the second way that scientists define creativity is almost the opposite. So it's called divergent thinking. So this is when you actually are trying to get all of the insights that you have from one kind of starting point. So it's like idea generation. And the best way for me to explain it is just to show you one of the tests they use to assess if you have divergent thinking. So an alternative uses task gives you a paperclip, and it asks you to come up with all the uses you can think of for a paperclip. So they'll give you a minute, and they will score you on 2 things. The first is going to be how original your ideas were. So if you say to hold papers together, that's not going to be a very original idea. But if you say you can use it to undo and then reset your VCR if it's not working, or if you say you can use it to weight the top of a paper airplane when you throw it so that it flies better, those might be more original and you would score higher for those. The other way that they look at this is not just originality, but they score it based on fluency. So fluency means the sheer amount of answers that you gave in 1 minute. Okay, and this is important for us as parents, because if this is a measure of creativity, the people who are not going to give a lot of ideas are the people who think their ideas are stupid, or the people who have been taught that there's one right answer. It's really important that we just allow that kind of talk, that kind of thinking about stuff to be free flowing in our kids' lives. So you want them to say things that don't make any sense, because then you go back and you look at everything you said over that minute, and then maybe you pick the best one. So in terms of what this looks like for us, these are active scaffolding opportunities for us. This is how you teach creativity. You do creative things. You make it a habit. You make them work at this idea of how do you see things in a big picture way. So this is a sentence or a figure completion. This is another test for creativity that measures divergent thinking. So you give one shape, and then you have a couple minutes to come up with what you think that shape would be if you could complete the picture. And so we do this test a lot, actually. It's really fun to do. Typically we'll do it a couple weeks in a row every day because the kids get really into it. So I'll just make a creative squiggle on a couple pieces of paper, and everybody will do it. And so here's an example of what one of my kids would come up with. So one turned it into a Pac-Man. Okay. One turned it into a girl's head. One turned it into a sideways squid being eaten by a giant fish, saying, "Ink attack, no one can stop me." All right, so this is it's cool because you get to have your own idea, and then you get to see what everybody else came up with. And so it's helping with your fluency, seeing that there's lots of different answers. It also is helping you kind of see things in an original way. Okay, so why does practice make us better at creativity? There's a couple reasons. The practice effect means that the more subjects create, or the more that our kids create, the better they get at it, and the more likely that those creative pathways will be used again. So you're boosting the interconnection between our neurons. The more they create, the more rewarding the experience is. So we're releasing dopamine. And as you get more proficient at something, it feels better. It's more rewarding. Then when more ideas are produced, this is this fluency idea, the number of more novel and useful ideas also increases proportionately. So we get better choices to pick from. All right, and we do these things through, neuroscience tells us we do these things through these two brain development mechanisms, through changes in myelination. Active pathways become more myelinated. Myelinated pathways go faster, so we get better at it. And second, through changes at the synapse, particularly with dopamine. This is what a synapse looks like, is the space in between one neuron and the next neuron. And dopamine is what is in these little vesicles by this number 1. This is the neuron who needs to send a message, has all these little vesicles filled with dopamine. The next neuron over here, number 2, has receptors that will respond to the dopamine once the dopamine is released into the space in between the two neurons. If they receive enough of that dopamine, they will send a message down the next neuron. And when this happens repeatedly, our bodies, our brains support these connections by giving more resources to them because we're using them. It makes sense to do it. These connections happen on dendritic spines. These are little tiny things on the dendrites of the neurons that are really plastic. They can come and they can go within minutes. Sometimes they can come, and if they keep being used and the connections are there on those spines, they can last a lifetime. And these arrows, this was taken in my lab on a dopaminergic neuron. So these are actually dopamine synapses. These little tiny spines are there, and you can see they're kind of sticking a couple of microns up off of this, the dendrite. The way that synaptic plasticity works, on the left-hand panel, you have 2 synapses. The one that has the lightning bolt is being used. And therefore, in the center panel, it's getting more support. It's actually growing from 1 synapse into 2 synapses. And the one that doesn't get any lightning, any input, is kind of not doing so well. It looks a little sick. So when you go to this last panel on the right, you see that our bodies, our brains are going to support and make robust the connections that we're using, and the ones that we're not using are going to wither away. Right? And this is really, really important for when we teach our kids things, because it's saying that what they practice, they're going to get better at. And this is the neuroscience underneath this idea. All right, so that leaves us with our third step, which is make space to be able to do this intentional practice. For creativity, remember, we can't force creativity. In fact, if you try to force it, have you ever been given the opportunity to like write a creative essay for extra credit, and all of a sudden you don't want to do it anymore? This idea of space is something that we have to get into our lives more. So space can be alone time. It can be simply just not having a plan. It's going to look like your kids saying, oh, I'm bored. I'm so bored. I'm so bored. It's going to look like your kid starting something and then stopping it because he's not engaged and going and bothering the person next to him. It's going to look like it's going to feel uncomfortable. All right. And so these are the times when scaffolding would come in the beginning. And eventually, as we scaffold more and more for our kids, not more and more in terms of like more invasive, but repetition. You want to be most invasive first and then try to back off the scaffolding, giving less and less direction. But, you know, the younger our kids are, the more they're going to need that scaffolding to set it up. And being disengaged. So this is really important. Turning off your phone, turning off interruptions, turning off the TV, turning off video games, turning off anything that's going to direct our minds and not allow us to be self-directed, to provide us the choices without us having to think about it. That's bad. You want to put your kids in situations where their choices are driven by themselves. And that even goes for things like practice for sports. If your coaches are constantly telling you what you're supposed to do after school, and your teachers are telling you in school, and your parents are making you do your homework, there's no time for creative thought, for alone time. And we have to build that into our lives somehow. Okay, so this can be carved out in a curriculum at school. It can be carved out at home in terms of what we give our kids. This idea of free play, freedom to make decisions, all of these things kind of fair game for them. In terms of what we can actually do at home, make physical space for creativity. If you have room to make a corner for blocks, or a corner for painting, or a corner for your kid to immerse in whatever they want to be an expert in, a little paleontology museum, whatever it is, if you can do a corner of your living room for a month for that, that would be amazing for them. You've got to make time for it. So you can say, you know what, it's creative time, go do something. If you're bored, I'm sorry. And you know what, that boredness, our human minds will funnel that boredness at some point into something. So this is, I gave my child a Sharpie and told him to go outside. And so this is what I got. He went down to the little creek and he pulled out these rocks. And the first one is the Titanic, and then the iceberg that hit it with a Sharpie. I think he was 6 maybe at the time. And then on the bottom, this one rock is, and these are kind of like this big, it's a drone. And then the other one is the remote control for the drone. So this is boredom at its extreme. But you know what? Our kids, their brains are so curious, and they want to be engaged with the world so much. They will create their own stuff if we allow them the space to be able to do it. This idea of free play is really important. Disconnecting from devices. Also teaching mindfulness and reflection. So having them check in with themselves, making sure that they understand overtly that quiet space is important, whether it's a moment of silence, whether it's a timeout, every day that people take as a siesta. You know, my kids took siestas long after they stopped taking naps, because I felt like they needed that reset time to be able to come back and fully kind of have recharged. So being reflective also really helps in terms of using timeout as a creative time to not just calm down after a conflict, but to not come out from the timeout until you have an idea about how creatively you can solve the problem is important. And then get enough sleep. There's a lot of evidence that says that kids who aren't getting enough sleep, adults who aren't getting enough sleep, have a really hard time being creative. And in particular, sleep can do really cool things for creativity. There have been a lot of inventions that have won the Nobel Prize that came to the inventors during a dream, and there's this idea of lucid dreaming. So lucid dreaming is a way that our bodies actually can control elements of our dream. And my son was actually telling me he had a lucid dream the other night where he was at high school, and one of the teachers actually turned into a monster, and he and his siblings with red eyes were able to actually control aspects of the dream. So in the dream, he knew he was dreaming. He was able to take a desk and like flip it towards the door to make an escape area. So the idea that he has power and control in his dream is really interesting in terms of creativity. And it's also really interesting in terms of providing a space for kids to have power and autonomy over things that they're struggling with, or just being empowered as a whole. There are ways to teach lucid dreaming. So if you want to Google it, it's pretty interesting. It has to do with basically training yourself to understand when you're asleep versus when you're awake. And you definitely can train this. I've done a study before where we were successful in training at least 1 or 2 people to be able to lucid dream over the course of a week or 2. So that then is kind of this idea of the space, that you have to leave the space there. But I think what's most important for us is that our focus matters. If we focus on creativity in ourselves, we make space for it, we think it's important, our kids will too. And I think that's really important in terms of life skills for them, but also it's really important for us, because when we're creative, we're better parents. If we can come up with rules that are flexible and we understand the root of a problem and can see all angles, this taps into self-control for us and empathy for us as well. And creativity is going to make us better at those 2 skills. And it's going to make us better at parenting. So if you are looking for more information, the book is obviously there. There's also, if you're interested in just straight up neuroscience, the last class that I taught at UVA, the neural basis of behavior, I did a 5-minute summary of each class just targeted for parents. It's on YouTube if you're interested in watching those. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and then I have a website as well for more information on articles that I've written that might be helpful to you guys as parenting resources. So thank you so much for listening. I get so excited talking about this kind of stuff. And I would be really happy to answer any questions that you have as best as I can.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Yeah, her book is also great. I will just tell you that I've checked it out and it's awesome. Let's start taking some questions. So we have somebody saying thank you in the chat.
You're welcome.
Do we have any questions for Erin right now? I feel like hopefully people are in the process of typing. Erin, did you get some questions on your?
Yeah, the ones I got, I already kind of incorporated into this,
Okay.
this slide. I think something that people are struggling with a little bit is, how to do this in the context of the pandemic and staying at home more and not having school. And I would say out of the 3 skills, this is probably the easiest one to work on at home because our kids are so bored right now. So it would be amazing if out of this whole global pandemic fiasco that we could end up having kids who actually could tap into their own resources, figure out how to be still, understand that everybody is going to be bored right now and that there's only so much screen time that you have. Like, I feel like there's a lot of kids that have really tightly regulated screen time, and they don't have that regulation as much anymore because we just don't have any other options. So they're on screens a lot more, such that it's almost like allowing your kid to eat too much dessert. And eventually they kind of stop choosing the sweet snacks. Do you know what I mean? And so I am seeing that a little bit with my kids, where they actually sometimes have been videoed out and they want to do something else, which is something I never thought that I would see with my kids, because usually I'm really careful about how much screen time they have. But I think that that's something that's happening across the board right now.
Can you talk a little bit more about how to scaffold? Because you use that word a lot, but I think since there's scaffolding at such different levels. Like, you know, a teenager probably needs a lot less of it to a certain degree than like a little kid would. So would you talk about a little bit about scaffolding at a younger age versus older, and maybe like just some examples of what that might look like?
Sure. So the idea of the scaffolding is that if you have the scaffold kind of while you're building the skills, then eventually you can kind of not be on the scaffold until you need to be. And then eventually the whole scaffold can be taken down and you have somebody who knows how to do whatever skill it is. So when you have a really young kid and you're trying to cultivate creativity, this is going to look more like we would see in a traditional preschool classroom where you can have a choice of what center to be at. So there might be 5 things and they get to use their choice there in terms of how to spend their time. But in terms of the creative thought, you want to make sure that that's not where it ends. So you want at some point the preschooler to not just play at one of the centers with blocks or with painting or with dress up, but you want them to be able to do free play that's really immersive. And it's free play that's mature, even in a preschooler, is long lasting. It has a theme and storyline. There are reoccurring characters with backstories, and preschoolers can totally do this. And they can, you know, this is the difference between playing at making a little pizza, you know, and serving it to your friend versus being Chef Boyardee who comes in and he makes the pizza, and then there's a homeless person who comes in and needs a job and he's employed in his kitchen, and then they end up, you know, giving all this to Stop Hunger Now, and like this whole backstory that cannot happen in 10 minutes. So this idea of letting them be there for longer periods of time, and with yourself kind of as a moderator that comes in when there's conflict and helps them go through it and redirects them back into what they think is important about the play, that's really important skill to do. So you want to be as hands-on as you need in the beginning, always thinking the important part is here, how can I get them to make this decision on their own without me? So you want to give them the structure enough that they can start and stay until you back away. And if they need you again, you can come back in. And that looks really different than what you would say for creativity for like a person in middle school, when they have a lot more of these other skills on board, like they have better conflict resolution skills by then, they have more knowledge and tools, they might already be an expert in something. So you can use more conversational tools rather than getting in their space physically in terms of being able to do that. And then by the time your kid is like in high school, you want to be able to say, tell me 5 other ways you could handle that situation rather than taking the car when I told you that you couldn't, right? And you want them to be able to come up with those. These are easy ways to kind of put into general, like looking at TV and movie. Why do you think the director chose to do that? I had thought it would look like this. What did you think it would look like? You know, all these really are conversation starters with the older kids. With the younger kids, it's more about putting the choices out there in a way that it's actually choice. So it's not telling them they can choose between mint chocolate chip and strawberry ice cream. That's the very start, but you can't stay there. You have to then end up asking them to learn how to make the ice cream. That's the real creative process, is actually doing things in a way that now you know how to do it, and how could you make the ice cream in a better way the next time.
Okay, that's awesome. We have another question from someone who says, how do you explain neurology to children?
So I would start with the neuron, just like I started with us today. And I would say kind of the parts of it. And I would say that the way that it works is it takes information from one and it gives it to another. And then I would talk to them specifically about the way that they can change that. So I think it's really important, especially with the current focus in our culture on genes and that you are what your genetics tell you that you are, to understand that that is actually not the case. Like your genetics is a blueprint. Every cell in your body turns on and off different genes to make that cell look like what it looks like. So like a hair cell has the same genes as your toe cell, but they look really different in terms of cells. And we can somewhat be in charge of that in our brains by using the neurons or not using the neurons in those pathways. You can basically bolster some synapses and turn on genes in that neuron that send the proteins down to build up those synapses. Or if we ignore them, then they go away. So this idea of us actually being in charge of our own brains, despite what our DNA says, is really important for kids to understand that. There's also, the Society for Neuroscience has some really great resources. They do Brain Awareness Week every March, and they have a lot of resources that help with talking to kids about neurons and about the brain and how it works. So I would look at their resources. And there's a Neuroscience for Kids website as well that's, I can't remember off the top of my head who does that, but it is a professor at another school. And that has some pretty basic explanations of how that works.
Nice. I was going to ask, how young can you really explain like neurons and dendrites to children? Like how young do you think that really makes sense to them?
I think that you can do it in a really easy way as soon as they understand that they have choice, and that if they choose one thing, this happens. If they choose one thing, another happens. And so that I don't think that that it's ever too early to start working on these things. So I certainly would be talking about the creativity, and these things before, preverbal children certainly can understand these concepts of just what does it mean to come up with your own ideas. In terms of how the brain works, I've definitely done brain awareness things in preschool classrooms, and they are on it. They are not too young. We can do a Jello brain, so that they can kind of see what the brain looks like, and it's kind of funny and jiggly. And we do a lot of work with the senses, so that's a really good entry point to teach littler kids about our brain. It's really concrete, what we see, what we smell, what we taste, and how we understand the world. That's a great way to start talking about it. And I think that, I still, in my college class, the way that I teach the brain areas first is I use Play-Doh. So we make a Play-Doh brain and kind of put the general areas on it. And you can simplify that and have it be the brain that tells you kind of what reasonable things to do. Underneath it, have the brain that tells you your gut impulse or your first thing, and then the spinal cord. Super easy, 3 things. Anybody can make that brain. We also often do a neuron out of pipe cleaners. So it's pretty easy to just make a cell body and make it kind of have hair for the dendrites and then a long axon. And then you can use actually beads to put on for myelin to say, oh, you put that on now it goes faster. So I think that it shouldn't be off limits, but it can be easy to feel off limits because it seems so complex. But I think the most important thing for learning about something is to make them interested in it. And the way we do that as parents is to talk about it. And it's fine to say, it's complex and I don't understand everything about it, but it's important. And let's do a Google search and see what we can find on it together. You can do that as young as kindergarten for sure.
That's awesome. That's great. And I appreciate the extra questions because, yeah, that was something that I'd thought about, but I forgot to write it down. So we have, she says, love that answer.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any other questions?
So there's one more from Avery. Can you see that one?
Yes.
Okay.
So it says, do you have any advice for letting your child know that you appreciate and encourage their creativity, but that sometimes getting something done, like meeting deadlines, planning things out in advance, etc., can require a little more structure? It can be hard to find that balance between giving creative space and respecting deadlines.
I hear you so loudly on this one. I know exactly what you're talking about. And it can totally seem like we have competing things going on here. So the answer for this one is going to be in the next session, which is the empathy one. So the thing that I usually say for creativity is you can have your own space and you can do it your own way until it affects someone else negatively, and then it's a no. And so that's a good way to put that boundary there so that they understand that they get to do that, and then it's fun to do that, and it can be rewarding to do that, but you can't impact other people in a way that makes it harder for other people. So the other kind of just practical parenting thing that I did not used to do and I do now, and it's really hard for me because I run late to everything, probably as the relic of having 4 kids with things to get in the car. But it's you have to allow yourself more time than you need, because the worst parent that I ever am is when I am so pressed for time and I have to get there. It allows me no space for something to go wrong. And because my life is so full, I only need one thing to go wrong. And then it's like, it's completely off rail. And you can't let your child sit with something. Like, you can't say, get your shoes on and get in the car, and this is the reasons why. And then you go sit in the car and wait for them. You cannot do that if you're running so late that you have to pick them up screaming and put them in the car. And so in that situation, I think you can motivate their behavior, you know, with rewards and things like that, but it doesn't allow them to do anything other than what you want them to do. And so this is an element in a realm that you have to put some space in there, but reasonable space. So you can say, you know what, they can have an extra couple minutes to figure out how to do it their way, but if it's not working, this is the time when I need to just come top down. You have to do that as a parent, or things will be crazy out of control. Like, I'm not saying let your child run your schedule and run your life. I'm saying that when the opportunity is there, your children will step into it. But they still need to be able to have the scaffolding of, you know what, it's really important to get to the doctor on time. That's important for his time and my time and your time too, honestly. And so it is a balancing act. So if you're able to come in 2 weeks to look at the empathy one, I think that will help a little bit how creativity ties into empathy and how you have to do that balance all the time.
Awesome. I don't see any other questions, but if you guys have them, ask them now. And I will just say too that on Erin's YouTube channel, you can find the first session of this. So maybe we hadn't planned this out the way that maybe we could have the first time to make them all in the same place. But now from this session on, we'll have at least all of these ones posted on the JMRL YouTube, but you can still find that first one, which is really great because it gives you a really good overview of everything that she talks about in her book, and a lot of these things with some really good examples. I always find the examples to be really helpful for the way that I learn in my brain and how I can actually apply things. So I would encourage you guys to go see that if you haven't gotten to already. Yeah, somebody in the chat says high school is such a hard time for kids to have unscheduled time. One really has to go against the tide to do that. So
yeah, and actually it becomes kind of important too, though, there for like the empathy situations, because that's the downtime that especially high schoolers need to be able to figure out what the best thing to do is, instead of just kind of blowing right through that. And they're connected all the time. But I mean, that's hard too, because you, again, can't force this stuff even more on a high schooler. Like, you might be able to force a 3-year-old to get in the car when you need to go. But, you know, I waited for my 16-year-old in the car for at least 7 minutes with 3 other kids yesterday. And he knows perfectly what, like, so I'm in there, you know, this is not a good time to teach empathy, right? It's annoying. So I get what you're saying, but carving out that time for a teenager may look more like, you know, downtime from the phone. Or there's all this research about immersion in nature. So forced immersion in nature, however much you can force a teenager to do anything, is really important as well. Because I think your goal with the teenager is more to do disconnection times. And if you feel like you can't do a giant chunk, like a half an hour or an hour, then try for 10 minutes. And just you saying, look, I don't care when you do it today. I want 10 minutes of disconnect. You can do it at 6 in the morning. You can do it at 6 in the afternoon, you know, while I'm making dinner. I just want you completely, like, not following anybody else's instructions and just disconnected. And you can probably see that they will be able to give you 10 minutes. And if you ask them for 10 minutes now, that might end up being an hour when they're 22. Or 3 hours when they're 35, because they'll realize the utility of it and they'll used to it being a part of their life.
I find that to be insanely helpful for myself when I have to just, I mean, I think that is a good thing for all of us to remember too, is that, yeah, we all need that disconnection time. Probably kids more than anybody, just because their brains are still in such a raw process of forming. But yeah, I definitely appreciate the downtime too, especially right now when we are also connected to screen.
In each other's space.
So, all right. Any other last minute questions? Thank you so much, Erin. This has been wonderful. And I'm looking forward to the next one about empathy.
Thank you so much for letting me talk and for you guys listening to me and talking about creativity. And I really hope that you do something very creative today just for you. If there's a way that you can carve out some time for your 10 minutes, I'm giving you permission to take it today.
Awesome.
All right, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for attending.